Chapter 5 continued of the Afghan Wars, 1839–42 and 1878–80. Part 1. The First Afghan War, by Archibald Forbes. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. The rising of the 2nd November may not have been the result of a fully organised plan. There are indications that it was premature, and that the revolt in force would have been postponed until after the expected departure of the Envoy and the General with all the troops except Shelton's brigade, but for an irrepressible burst of personal rancour against Burnes. Durand holds, however, that the malcontents acted on the belief that to kill Burnes and sack the Treasury was to inaugurate the insurrection with an imposing success. Be this as it may, a truculent mob early in the morning of November 2nd assailed Burnes's house. He at first regarded the outbreak as a casual riot, and wrote to Macnaghten to that effect. Having harangued the throng without effect, he and his brother, along with William Broadfoot, his secretary, prepared for defence. Broadfoot was soon killed, and a little later Burnes and his brother were hacked to pieces in the garden behind the house. The Treasury was sacked. The sepoys who had guarded it and Burnes's house were massacred, and both buildings were fired. The armed mob swelled in numbers, and soon the whole city was in a roar of tumult. Prompt and vigorous military action would no doubt have crushed the insurrection, at least for the time, but the indifference, vacillation and delay of the British authorities greatly encouraged its rapid development. Macnaghten at first, did not think much of it. Shelton was ordered into the Bala Hissar, countermanded, a second time ordered, and again instructed to halt for orders. At last the Envoy himself despatched him with the loose order to act on his own judgment in communication with the Shah. Shelton marched into the Bala Hissar with part of his force, and the rest of it was moved into the cantonments. When the brigadier went to the Shah, that potentate demanded to know who sent him and what he had come for. But the Shah, to do him justice, had himself taken action. Informed that Burnes was attacked and the city in revolt, he had ordered Campbell's regiment of his own levies and a couple of guns to march to his assistance. Campbell recklessly attempted to push his way through the heart of the city instead of reaching Burnes's house by a circuitous but opener route, and after some sharp street fighting in which he lost heavily, he was driven back, unable to penetrate to the scene of plunder and butchery. Shelton remained inactive in the Bala Hissar until Campbell was reported beaten and retreated, when he took some feeble measures to cover the retreat of the fugitives, who, however, abandoned their guns outside the fortress. The day was allowed to pass without anything further being done, except the dispatch of an urgent recall to Major Griffiths, whom Sale had left at Kubbar-e-Jubbar, and that good soldier, having fought every step of the way through the passes, brought in his detachment in unbroken order and without loss of baggage, notwithstanding his weakness in transport. Shelton, reinforced in the Bala Hissar, maintained an intermittent and ineffectual fire on the city. Urgent orders were dispatched to Sale, recalling him and his brigade, orders with which, as has been mentioned, Sale did not comply, and also to Nott at Kandahar, begging him to send a brigade to Cabul. In compliance with this requisition, Maclaren's brigade immediately started from Kandahar, but soon returned owing to the inclemency of the weather. Captain Mackenzie was in charge of a fort containing the Shah's commissariat stores. This fort was on the outskirts of a suburb of Cabul, and was fiercely attacked on the 2nd. For 2 days Mackenzie maintained his post with unwearying constancy. His garrison was short of water and of ammunition, and the fort was crowded with women and children, but he held on resolutely until the night of the 3rd. No assistance was sent, no notice indeed of any kind was taken of him. His garrison was discouraged by heavy loss, and by the mines which the enemy were pushing forward. At length, when the gate of the fort had been fired, and his wounded were dying for lack of medical aid, he evacuated the fort, and fought his way gallantly into cantonments, bringing in his wounded and the women and children. With this solitary exception, the Afghans had nowhere encountered resistance, and the strange passiveness of our people encouraged them to act with vigour. From the enclosed space of the Shah Bagh, and the adjacent forts of Mahmud Khan and Mohammed Sharif, they were threatening the Commissariat fort, hindering access to it, and besetting the southwestern flank of the cantonments. A young officer commanded the 100 sepoys garrisoning the Commissariat fort. He reported himself in danger of being cut off, and Elphinstone gave orders that he and his garrison should be brought off, and the fort and its contents abandoned. Several efforts to accomplish the withdrawal were thwarted by the Afghan flanking fire, with the loss of several officers and many men. The commissary officer urged on the general the disastrous consequences which the abandonment of the fort would entail, containing as it did all the stores, adding that in cantonments there were only 2 days' supplies, without prospect of procuring any more. Orders were then sent to Warren to hold out to the last extremity, which instructions he denied having received. Early in the morning of the 5th, troops were preparing to attack the Afghan fort and reinforce the Commissariat fort, when Warren and his garrison reached the cantonments. The gate of the Commissariat fort had been fired, but the enemy had not effected an entrance, yet Warren and his people had evacuated the fort through a hole cut in its wall. Thus, with scarcely a struggle to save it, was this vital fort allowed to fall into the enemy's hands, and thenceforward our unfortunate people were to be reduced to precarious and scanty sources for their food. From the 5th to the 9th of November there was a good deal of desultory fighting, in the course of which, after one failure, Mohammed Sharif's fort was stormed by a detachment of our people, under the command of Major Griffiths. But this success had little influence on the threatening attitude maintained by the Afghans. On the 9th, owing to the mental and physical weakness of poor General Elphinstone, Brigadier Shelton was summoned into cantonments from the Bala Hissar, bringing with him part of the garrison with which he had been holding the latter post. The hopes entertained that Shelton would display vigour and restore the confidence of the troops were not realised. He from the first had no belief in the ability of the occupants of the cantonment to maintain their position, and he never ceased to urge prompt retreat on Jellalabad. From the purely military point of view he was probably right. The Duke of Wellington shared his opinion when he said in the House of Lords, quote, "After the first few days, particularly after the negotiations at Cabul had commenced, it became hopeless for General Elphinstone to maintain his position." Unquote. Shelton's situation was unquestionably a very uncomfortable one, for Elphinstone, broken as he was, yet allowed his second in command no freedom of action, and was testily pertinacious of his prerogative of command. If in Shelton, who after his manner was a strong man, there had been combined with his resolution some tact and temper, he might have exercised a beneficial influence. As it was, he became sullen and despondent, and retired behind an quote, uncommunicative and disheartening reserve. Unquote. Brave as he was, he seemed to have lacked the inspiration which alone could reinvigorate the drooping spirit of the troops. In a word, though he probably was, in army language, a quote, good duty soldier, unquote, he certainly was nothing more, and something more was needed then. Action on Shelton's part became necessary the day after he came into cantonments. The Afghans occupied all the forts on the plain between the Siah Sung heights and the cantonments, and from the nearest of them, the Rikabashi fort, poured in a heavy fire at close range, which the return artillery fire could not quell. On Macnaghten's urgent requisition, the general ordered out a strong force under Shelton to storm the obnoxious fort. Captain Bellew missed the gate and blew open merely a narrow wicket, but the storming party obeyed the signal to advance. Through a heavy fire the leaders reached the wicket and forced their way in, followed by a few soldiers. The garrison of the fort hastily evacuated it, and all seemed well, when a sudden stampede ensued. The handful which, led by Colonel Mackrell of the 44th and Lieutenant Bird of the Shah's force, had already entered the fort, remaining inside it. The runaway troops were rallied with difficulty by Shelton and the subordinate officers, but a call for volunteers from the European regiment was responded to but by one solitary Scottish private. After a second advance and a second retreat, a retreat made notwithstanding strong artillery and musketry support, Shelton's efforts brought his people forward yet again, and this time the fort was occupied in force. Of those who had previously entered it, but 2 survivors were found. The Afghans, re-entering the fort, had hacked Mackrell to pieces and slaughtered the men who tried to escape by the wicket. Lieutenant Bird and a sepoy, from a stable the door of which they had barricaded with logs of wood, had fended off their assailants by a steady and deadly fire, and when they were rescued by the entrance of the troops, they had to clamber out over a pile of 30 dead Afghans, whom the bullets of the 2 men had struck down. It had come to our people in those gloomy days to regard as a triumph a combat in which they were not actually worsted, and even of such dubious successes the last occurred on November 13th, when the Afghans, after having pressed our infantry down the slopes of the Bemerau ridge, were driven back by artillery fire and forced by a cavalry charge to retreat further, leaving behind them a couple of guns from which they had been sending missiles into the cantonments. One of those guns was brought in without difficulty, but the other the Afghans covered with their jezail fire. The envoy had sent a message of entreaty that, quote, "the triumph of the day," unquote, should be completed by its capture. Major Scott of the 44th made appeal on appeal, ineffectually, to the soldierly feelings of his men, and while they would not move, the sepoys could not be induced to advance. At length Eyre spiked the piece as a precautionary measure, and finally some men of the Shah's infantry succeeded in bringing in the prize. The return march of the troops into cantonments in the dark was rendered disorderly by the close pressure of the Afghans, who, firing incessantly, pursued the broken soldiery up to the entrance gate. On the depressed garrison of the Cabul cantonments, tidings of disaster further afield had been pouring in apace. Soon after the outbreak of the rising, it was known that Lieutenant Moule, commanding the Kohistanee regiment at Kurdurah, had been cut to pieces with his adjutant and sergeant major by the men of his own corps, and on November 6th intelligence had come in that the Gurkha regiment stationed at Charikar in the Kohistan, where Major Pottinger was resident, was in dangerous case, and that Codrington, its commandant, and some of his officers had already fallen. And now, on the 15th, there rode wearily into cantonments 2 wounded men, who believed themselves the only British survivors of the Charikar force. Pottinger was wounded in the leg. Houghton, the adjutant of the Gurkha corps, had lost his right hand, and his head hung forward on his breast, half severed from his body by a great tulwar slash. Of the miserable story which it fell to Pottinger to tell, only the briefest summary can be given. His residence was at Lumani, a few miles from the Charikar cantonments, when early in the month a number of chiefs of the Kohistan and Nijrao country assembled to discuss with him the terms on which they would reopen the communications with Cabul. Those chiefs proved treacherous, slew Rattray, Pottinger's assistant, and besieged Pottinger in Lumani. Finding his position untenable, he withdrew to Charikar under cover of night. On the morning of the 5th the Afghans assailed the cantonments. Pottinger was wounded, Codrington was killed, and the Gurkhas were driven into the barracks. Houghton, who succeeded to the command of the regiment, made sortie on sortie, but was finally driven in, and the enemy renewed their assaults in augmented strength. Thenceforward the position was all but hopeless. On the 10th the last scant remains of water was distributed. Efforts to procure water by sorties on the nights of the 11th and 12th were not successful, and the corps fell into disorganisation because of losses, hardships, exhaustion, hunger and thirst. Pottinger and Houghton agreed that there was no prospect of saving even a remnant of the regiment unless by a retreat to Cabul, which, however, was clearly possible only in the case of the stronger men, unencumbered with women and children, of whom unfortunately there was a great number in the garrison. On the afternoon of the 13th Houghton was cut down by a treacherous native officer of the artillery, who then rushed out of the gate, followed by all the gunners and most of the Mohammedans of the garrison. In the midst of the chaos of disorganisation, Dr Grant amputated Houghton's hand, dressed his other wounds, and then spiked all the guns. When it was dark the garrison moved out, Pottinger leading the advance, Dr Grant the main body, and Ensign Rose the rear guard. From the beginning of the march discipline was all but entirely in abeyance. On reaching the first stream the last remains of control were lost and the force was rapidly disintegrating. Pottinger and Houghton, the latter only just able to keep the saddle, pushed on towards Cabul, rested in a ravine during the day, evaded the partisan detachment sent out from Cabul to intercept them, rode through sleeping Cabul in the small hours of the morning, and after being pursued and fired upon in the outskirts of the city, finally attained the cantonments. It was afterwards learned that a portion of the regiment had struggled on to within 20 miles from Cabul, gallantly headed by young Rose and Dr Grant. Then the remnant was destroyed. Rose was killed after dispatching 4 Afghans with his own hand. Dr Grant, escaping the massacre, held on until within 3 miles of the cantonments, when he too was killed. Macnaghten was naturally much depressed by the news communicated by Pottinger, and realised that the Afghan masses already encompassing the position on the Cabul plain would certainly be increased by bands from the Kohistan and Nizrao, flushed already with their Charikar success. He sided strongly with the large party among the officers who were advocating the measure of abandoning the cantonments altogether, and moving the force now quartered there to the safer and more commanding position in the Bala Hissar. The military chiefs opposed the project, and propounded a variety of objections to it, none of which were without weight, yet all of which might have been overcome by energy and proper dispositions. Shelton, however, was opposed to the scheme, since if carried out it would avert or postpone the accomplishment of his policy of retreat on Jellalabad. Elphinstone was against it in the inertia of debility, and the project gradually came to be regarded as abandoned. Another project, that of driving the Afghans from Mahmud Khan's fort, commanding the direct road between the cantonments and the Bala Hissar, and of occupying it with a British force, was so far advanced that the time for the attempt was fixed, and the storming party actually warned, when some petty objection intervened and the enterprise was abandoned, never to be revived. The rising was not 3 days old when already Elphinstone had lost heart. On the 5th he had written to Macnaghten suggesting that the latter should, quote, "consider what chance there is of making terms," unquote. And since then he had been repeatedly pressing on the envoy the, quote, "hopelessness of further resistance," unquote. Macnaghten, vacillating as he was, yet had more pith in his nature than was left in the debilitated old general. He wrote to Elphinstone on the 18th recommending, not very strenuously, the policy of holding out where they were as long as possible, and indeed throughout the winter, if subsistence could be obtained. He pointed out that in the cantonments, which he believed to be impregnable, there were at least the essentials of wood and water. Arguing that a retreat on Jellalabad must be most disastrous, and was to be avoided except in the last extremity, he nevertheless ended somewhat inconsistently by leaving to the military authorities if in 8 or 10 days there should appear no prospect of an improvement of the situation, the decision whether it would be wiser to attempt a retreat or to withdraw from the cantonments into the Bala Hissar. Far from improving, the situation was speedily to become all but hopeless. The village of Behmaroo, built on the north-eastern slope of the ridge of the same name bounding the plain on the north-west, lay about half a mile due north of the cantonments, part of which some of the houses on the upper slope commanded. From this village, after the loss of the commissariat fort, our people had been drawing supplies. On the morning of the 22nd, the Afghans were seen moving in force from Cabul towards Behmaroo, obviously with intent to occupy the village and so deprive the occupants of the cantonments of the resource it had been affording them. A detachment under Major Swain, sent out to forestall this occupation, found Behmaroo already in the possession of a body of Kohistanis, who had so blocked the approaches that Swain did not consider himself justified in attempting the fulfilment of his orders to storm the place, and he contented himself with maintaining all day an ineffectual musketry fire on it. A diversion in his favour by a gun supported by cavalry had no result save that of casualties to the gunners and troopers. Reinforcements brought out by Shelton effected nothing, and in the evening the troops were recalled. On this ill-fated day Akbar Khan, Dost Mahomed's fierce and implacable son, arrived in Cabul, and the evil influence on the British fortunes which he exerted immediately made itself felt, for the events of the following day were to bring about a crisis in the fate of our ill-starred people. Recognising the mischief wrought by the hostile occupation of our only source of supplies, the Envoy strongly urged the immediate despatch of a strong force to occupy the Behmaroo ridge and dislodge from the village its Kohistani garrison. Shelton opposed the measure, urging the dispirited state of the troops, their fatigue from constant defensive duty, and their weakened physique because of poor and scanty rations. He was overruled, and before daybreak of the 23rd, a force under his command, consisting of 5 companies of the 44th, 12 companies of native infantry, some cavalry, and 1 horse artillery gun, was in position on the north-eastern extremity of the ridge overhanging the village. The gun opened fire on the village with grape, and after a short resistance the greater part of its garrison quitted it. The storming party, entrusted to Major Swain, did not, however, act, and was withdrawn. Leaving a detachment on the knoll above the village, Shelton moved his force along the upland to a position near the gorge intersecting the ridge, forming his infantry into 2 squares, with the cavalry in rear. The further hill beyond the gorge was crowded with hostile Afghans from Cabul, and the long-range fire of their jezails across the dividing depression carried execution into the squares which Shelton had inexplicably formed, as if to furnish his foes with a target which they could not miss. The muskets of his men could not retaliate, and the skirmishers he threw forward to the brow of his hill could not endure the Afghan fire. Shelton's single gun maintained a hot and telling fire on the Afghan masses on the opposite hill, and balked an attempt against his right flank made by the Afghan cavalry swarming in the outer plain. But when its vent became too hot for the gunners to serve it, the dullest comprehension became alive to the folly of sending a single gun into the field. Shelton's men, falling fast though they were, and faint with fatigue and thirst, yet had endured for hours a fusillade to which they could not reply, when a body of Afghan fanatics suddenly sprang up out of the gorge, swept back with their fire the few skirmishers who had been still holding the brow of the hill, and planted their flag within 30 yards of the front of the nearer of the squares. Shelton offered a large reward to the man who should bring it in, but there was no response. In a passion of soldierly wrath, the veteran commanded a bayonet charge. Not a man sprang forward at the summons which British soldiers are wont to welcome with cheers. The cowed infantry remained supine, when their officers darted forward and threw stones into the faces of the enemy. The troopers heard but obeyed not, that trumpet call to charge, which so rarely fails to thrill the cavalryman with the rapture of the fray. The gunners only, men of that noble force, the company's horse artillery, quitted themselves valiantly. They stood to their piece to the bitter end. 2 of them were killed beside it, another was severely wounded, a fourth, refusing to run, took refuge under the gun, and miraculously escaped death. But the gallant example of the artillerymen in their front did not hearten the infantrymen of the leading square. The panic spread among them, and they broke and fled. Fortunately they were not pursued. The rear square stood fast, and the officers, by great exertion, succeeded in rallying the fugitives under the cover it afforded. The news that a principal chief, Abdullah Khan, had been severely wounded in the plain gave pause to the offensive vigour of the Afghans, and the assailants fell back, abandoning the gun, but carrying off the limber and gun team. Our people reoccupied the position, the gun recommenced its fire, and if the cavalry and infantry could have been persuaded to take the offensive, the battle might have been retrieved, but they remained passive. The reinforced Afghans renewed their long-range fire with terrible effect. Most of the gunners had fallen, and the brigadier, recognising the growing unsteadiness of his command, and the imminent danger of capture to which the solitary gun was again exposed, ordered a retirement on the detachment left near Behmaroo, and the limbering up of the gun, to which a second limber had been sent out from the cantonments. The movement was scarcely begun when a rush of fanatic Afghans completely broke the square, and all order and discipline then disappeared. A regular rout set in down the hill toward cantonments, the fugitives disregarding the efforts of the officers to rally them, and the enemy in full pursuit, the Afghan cavalry making ghastly slaughter among the panic-stricken runaways. The detachment near Behmaroo attempted to fall back in orderly fashion, but the reinforced garrison of the village swept out upon it, surrounded it, broke it up, and threw it into utter rout, with the loss of a large proportion of its strength, one whole company being all but annihilated. It seemed as if pursued and pursuers would enter the cantonments together, so closely were they commingled. But the fire from the ramparts and an opportune charge of horse arrested the pursuit. Yet Eyre reckons as the chief reason why all the British force that had gone out to battle was not destroyed, the fact that a leading Afghan chief forced his men to spare the fugitives, and ultimately halted and withdrew his people when the opportunity for wholesale slaughter lay open to them. Most of the wounded were left on the field, where they were miserably cut to pieces, and the gun, which had been overturned in the attempt of the drivers to gallop down the face of the hill, finally passed into the possession of the Afghans. Shelton's dispositions as a commander could not well have been worse. His bearing as a soldier, although undaunted, imparted to his hapless troops nothing of inspiration. The obstinacy with which he held the hill, after the impossibility of even partial success must have been patent to him, was universally condemned. It need scarcely be added that his loss was very severe. No more fighting was possible. What then was to be done? Elphinstone and Shelton were at one in opposing removal into the Bala Hissar. Macnaghten, to whom Shah Soojah had communicated his urgent recommendation of that measure as the only expedient which could secure the safety of the British troops, fell in with the views of the military authorities. There came to him a letter from Osman Khan, the chief who had called off his adherents on the previous day from pursuing the fugitives fleeing into cantonments. Osman wrote that, if his troops had followed up their successes, the loss of the cantonments and the destruction of the British forces were inevitable; but, he continued, that it was not the wish of the chiefs to proceed to such extremities, their sole desire being that our people should quietly evacuate the country, leaving the Afghan Sirdars to govern it according to their own customs, and with a king of their own choosing. In communicating this letter to General Elphinstone, Sir William asked for the latter's opinion on the military possibility, or the reverse, of the retention of the British position in Afghanistan. Elphinstone in reply enumerated sundry reasons which led him to the conclusion which he stated, that 'it is not feasible any longer to maintain our position in this country, and that you ought to avail yourself of the offer to negotiate which has been made to you.' Chapter 6.